As I say, the Shadow Defence Secretary, James Cartledge, joins me now. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Mr Cartledge. We've seen the letter from Kemi Badenoch to Keir Starmer basically urging for more defence spending to be announced before Starmer heads to Washington for his meeting with Donald Trump on Thursday. But I need to put it to you, Mr Cartledge, that I'm wondering whether the Tories actually have a leg to stand on when it comes to defence spending. In real terms, defence spending fell by 22% between 2009 and 10 and 2016 and 17. Spending as a share of GDP was at its lowest in 2015. That was when the Tories were in power. And between then and now, defence spending is only increased in real terms by a total of £8.5 billion. So actually, defence spending has gone down under the Tories' watch, not up.
Well, if you go back to the end of the last Labour government back in 2010, obviously the challenge we had then as a country is that we faced bankruptcy, essentially. The Chief Secretary of the Treasury, who was in charge of public finances under Labour, had left a note for us that there's no money left. So we did have to take very difficult and painful decisions. Actually, the Labour government were planning, if they'd won, to cut defence spending by 25%. So, yeah, we did have to take some difficult decisions then. But the thing I would stress is that, you look at 2019, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, the threat position was already starting to worsen, and we had the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War, when it went up to 2.3%. It's been sustained at that level since. But we do think, given what's happening, it does need to go up again.
OK, so considering that admission then, do you admit now that it was a mistake not to invest more in defence spending? I appreciate what you're saying about the austerity years. I also appreciate what you're saying about what Labour were planning to do, but that was under Jeremy Corbyn, which probably isn't the closest comparator to sensible politics. So do you now regret that you didn't spend more on defence?
Just to clarify, Camilla, just to clarify, Camilla, I wasn't talking about Jeremy Corbyn. I was talking about, had Labour won in 2010, they had a plan which was to cut defence spending by 25%.
OK. I'm sure that Jeremy Corbyn may well have doubled down on that pledge when he ran for office. But in terms of the Tories' own record then, Mr Cartledge, just in light of everything that Donald Trump has said in recent days, do you now regret that the Tories didn't invest more on defence spending?
Well, the challenge for the country at the time was to get the books in order. We were facing terrible financial crisis. Just to put it in context, because I think a lot of people aren't aware of this figure, right? The budget deficit, which is the country's overdraft, which Labour inherited when they won the election last July, was 4.4%. It was over 10%. It was over 10% in 2010 when we took over, and the difference, if it had been 10% last July, the difference is about 160 billion. That's the size of the NHS's budget last year in England. Just to give you a sense of the scale. So yes, we had to make very difficult decisions, and obviously we'd rather not have done that. Of course, we would rather not have done that. But you have to govern in the national interest, and that was the national interest at the time.
One more question looking backwards, because we must look forward, but the counter-argument to that is, why on earth did David Cameron spend so much on foreign aid? He could have ploughed that money into defence. So you did have choices back then. Many people criticised him for putting so much into foreign aid. He did that, arguably, at the expense of our own defences.
Well, I mean, look, as you say, we can debate the past as long as we want to. I think the key thing is we did have to take some very, very difficult decisions at the time. I also think in the international situation we were in, there was also a bit more of a consensus, and not everyone would have agreed with this at the time, that aid was an important way of helping to improve our security by investing in countries becoming less unstable abroad, etc.
It didn't really work, though, did it?
Like, of the nation-to-nation military. Let me finish, Gula. There was less of the nation-to-nation military threat that we now face today. It's a very serious threat. That doesn't mean I wish we hadn't spent more at the time, but we had to make those difficult decisions. And as I say, but the real test here is that you spend according to the threat you face. And in 2019, with the threat picture starting to deteriorate, we increased spending, the biggest sustained increase since the Cold War, to 2.3%. 2.3%, actually significantly more than a lot of other NATO countries. But look, we got to election. If you want to measure, do we think, how much do we think defence spending should go up by? Are we true to our word? Well, we stood at the general election with a plan to increase again to 2.5%, funded by reducing the size of the civil service. But I think how I would summarise it is this, that basically since the Second World War, defence spending has been falling, particularly since the end of the Cold War. We thought we were in a new era of peace. That's clearly not the case anymore, and so spending is starting to go back up again, and it has to, and we have to be open with the country about that. And the letter from Kemi Badenoch today makes clear we as a party are willing to be serious and face up to the difficult decisions you've got to make if you're going to find the money to significantly increase defence spending, as we have to deliver security for our country.
We could summarise by saying that defence spending has gone down as the state has got larger under both Labour and Conservative successive governments. But let's move on to what Trump actually said, because I'd like to know from you whether you think he's right or wrong on the following assertions. Did the Ukrainians start the conflict in either 2014 or 2022?
No, they were invaded by Russia.
OK, is Zelensky a dictator without elections?
Nope. He is a democratically elected leader. He is not holding elections because his country is under martial law, because it is at war. When we were at war, Winston Churchill didn't hold elections because that was the national interest at the time.
Has Ukraine strong-armed the United States into spending hundreds of billions of dollars to, quotes, go into a war that couldn't be won?
Well, America has actually given a huge amount of aid to Ukraine. We should recognise that. I think it's tens of billions of dollars. We have also, relative to the size of our military, actually probably been the most generous donor, if you measure it in those terms. We've given a huge amount of our inventory. We had to do that. It was in our national interest. If Ukraine had fallen early and capitulated, I think the world would be in a far more dangerous position than it is now. It's not in a good position now, but it would have been, Russia's forces would have been right on the edge of NATO and threatening us directly, I feel. So it was the right thing to do, and I think we should recognise in that America did give significant aid.
OK, and what do you make of Trump's comment, Zelensky better move faster, he's not going to have a country left?
If you've brought me on to go through every one of Donald Trump's comments, well, fair enough. I mean, look, I think I want to step back and say he has his mandate, and we respect that. Donald Trump was elected President of the United States with a clear mandate. He said to his people he wanted to get a peace deal quickly in Ukraine, and he is proceeding with his usual vigour to try and achieve that, and we have to represent our national interests in this. And what I would say is I think they overlap very strongly, and the key thing that I want to see is that when the Prime Minister Keir Starmer goes out to Washington, he stresses that an outcome we must avoid is that if Russia is seen in any way to win from any kind of settlement, should there be one, I think that would be bad for the United States and for ourselves and all of NATO, because it would send a terrible message to other adversaries, not least China, and I think it would embolden them.
All right, James Cartledge, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Lovely to speak to you. Well, retired General Lord Richard Dannett, the former Chief of the General Staff, joins me now. Lord Dannett, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. I'm going to ask you a fairly straightforward question that probably doesn't have a straightforward answer, but how does this end? How does it end in Ukraine now? Trump has said what he said, Zelensky's saying what he's saying, and we've got Starmer and Trump due to meet in Washington on Thursday.
Well, as you said, Camilla, there is no easy answer to this. I'm afraid, in my view, we are in a no different place to where we were 3 years ago, with Putin having wanted to take over the whole of Ukraine, absorb Ukraine back into Russia, and Zelensky perfectly reasonably wanting to defend the sovereignty and independence of his country. Those positions are irreconcilable, and frankly, nothing has really changed. I mean, what is changing in the middle of that is Donald Trump's desire, his rhetoric, his grandstanding to say that he wants to end the war. Now, that's perfectly reasonable and laudable, but the question is how to do it. And he hasn't got a formula as to how to do it. What he's pressing for is some kind of ceasefire. But a ceasefire would probably be the worst outcome at the present time. Yes, of course, the killing would stop and the consumption of ammunition and all the rest of it would stop. But the effect that that would have would then be to give time back to the Russians to reconstitute their armed forces, to regather their strength, and consider either pressing again in a new offensive in Ukraine, or even worse than that, pressing somewhere else against another European country that has a common border with Russia. And it's all that thinking which is behind the pressure that so many of us have been trying to argue the case for not just months, but for years, that we in this country and other European countries should increase their defence spending to make sure that not that we're capable of fighting a war, but we've got a sufficiently capable set of armed forces that we can deter further aggression from Russia. That's what this is really all about. And that's why, yes, it's good to move eventually to 2.5% of GDP, but 3 or 3.5% is actually nearer the mark.
So, Lord Dannett, I can't be the only person that's quite confused about President Trump's stance in all this. On one hand, it does look as if he is handing some kind of victory to Putin if Putin can walk away with what is effectively stolen Ukrainian territory. However, the pragmatist in me says, you know, the Ukrainian people are tired, they've had enough, the Europeans and America haven't given them enough armaments to win this war, they've only given them enough armaments not to lose it completely. And then equally, what are we saying? Are you saying that you think the Western world, a little bit like in 2014, is once again being quite naive? This idea, oh, we cede 20% of Ukrainian territory back to Putin, we put some troops on the ground there in Ukraine, we make sure that Ukraine is viewed as a sovereign nation, and he will then leave the Baltic states alone. Is this the Western world once again being asleep at the wheel, do you think?
What you've just described there, Camilla, is the supreme act of appeasement. And if we go back to our history books and look at the 1930s, that's exactly what happened then. Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia were negotiated away between Western powers, Neville Chamberlain in particular, and Adolf Hitler, over the heads of the people that were concerned. And what did that lead to? It didn't lead to peace, it led to war. It led to war largely because we were weak. And here we are again, all these years later, in the same sort of position. So I'm afraid, go back to the earlier part of the conversation we were having, I can't see any practical alternative other than countries, hopefully still the United States, but maybe less likely them, but other European countries, continuing to double down on our support to Zelensky and Ukraine, and endeavor to allow the Ukrainians to be as strong as they can. Yes, 20% of their country is now in Russian hands, but that doesn't mean we should give up on the principle of that being sovereign Ukrainian territory. Yes, Ukraine would like to be an independent country. It would like to be a member of the EU, and one day it would like to be a member of NATO. That's entirely legitimate. What Zelensky doesn't want to do is to allow his country to drift back to where it was in the days of the Cold War under Russian Soviet domination. He's rejecting that form of lifestyle. He wants the kind of lifestyle that we enjoy in the West. And that's perfectly reasonable. And we have an absolute duty to support them. Frankly, what Trump does is just mystifying. He may well have duped a sufficient majority of the American people to think that his rhetoric will make America great again. But don't let us get dragged down and let him make the West weak again. Frankly, it's not acceptable. And if he's not prepared to be a leader on the world stage, we've got to find some Europeans to stand up and show that leadership themselves.
What do you make so far of Keir Starmer's leadership on this issue? We've got John Healey, the Defence Secretary, writing in the Sunday Times today, very much showing his allegiance to President Zelensky. How do you think the Labour government is handling this?
Well, they're handling it as well as they can, given that they are absolutely hamstrung and caught in the headlights of spending. We've heard so much about the black hole that they inherited from the last government. And frankly, let's remember that in 2010, when David Cameron became Prime Minister, the then Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the outgoing Labour one, left a message on the desk saying, there is no money. So we've been there before. So let's not go forward looking back over our shoulders. Let's look at the situation today, which actually is even different from July last year. Look at the situation today and say, what needs to be done? And if what needs to be done means that we've got to spend more money directly supporting Ukraine, spend more money in increasing our defence capability, then that's what we've got to do. And if, goodness me, Camilla, if that means we've got to put up taxes in this country, shock horror, let's do it. And you and I and everyone else watching this programme will have to shoulder some of the burden. When times are tough, we all have to tighten our belts and we have to accept sacrifices. And if that's in the greater interest of the security of this country, that's much more important than new hospitals, roads, schools, and critical national infrastructure. Our security is what matters most. We have to pay for it.
And Lord Dannett, finally and briefly, we have this situation where you're describing what you think is going on right now as a form of appeasement. So is it overstating it to suggest that Starmer, not least because of the lack of leadership in the rest of Europe, in France and Germany, both on a precipice when it comes to forthcoming elections, does this mean that Starmer needs to be the Churchill figure here? And is he capable of that?
Well, I don't know whether he's capable, but he has the opportunity. He's going to have a difficult time when he goes to the White House on Thursday, but John Healey, his defense secretary, are making the right noises. Rachel Reeves will hate this from a spending point of view. But go back to what I was saying just now. When needs must, then things must be done. This is Starmer's opportunity to try and show some Churchillian characteristics. And why not? This is a great opportunity. Don't be faced down by Trump, bullied by Trump. Britain can stand up for Europe. And I think this is his opportunity. So come on, Keir Starmer, give it a good go.
All right, fair enough. Wise words from you as ever, Lord Dannatt. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning on GB News.